Grant Gillard, pastor at the New Horizon Presbyterian Church. It's Wednesday evening, and I thought I would do a little something just for fun tonight. Sunday we'll probably have a normal video conferencing type sermon and worship service. That's just, we're trying to do the best we can to stay connected. As you can see, my razor and I are very adept at practicing social distancing. I can't get within 6 feet of that thing. It's just the way things are during this pandemic. Well, question for tonight is, what is your perception of God? Is God this vengeful, capricious, punitive deity that just relishes in punishing us for our stupidity? Or is God gracious? Is God merciful? Is God our rock and our fortress, a very present help in times of trouble? We all got different kind of perceptions on who God is. And I tell you, if you stumble into a conversation and people all of a sudden realize you're a pastor, they want to share their perceptions of who they think God is. Oftentimes this is based on some kind of tragedy or some kind of a horrible accident, or maybe it's when grandma got cancer and as a small child they prayed and prayed and prayed and grandma died. Now, what kind of a God would let grandma die? I prayed, and we get these perceptions, and sometimes it's a hard uphill battle to try and change them. But when I was in seminary, we used to debate these things, and debate them in a very academic way. We talk about in our modern faith, and it's been a kind of a historic faith as well, there are two things that are very significant, two foundational principles. One principle is God is all-powerful. God can do anything. Another one is God is love. God is patient. God is kind. God is benevolent. But when you start looking at these two foundational principles, we got this all-powerful God. But sometimes God doesn't intervene. Like take today, there are locusts swarming the crops in Africa. If God is all-powerful, why doesn't God stop that? Why doesn't God stop this thing we call the coronavirus, the COVID-19? If God is all-powerful, God could. So why doesn't? Part of the dilemma may be that God is not all-powerful. Or maybe God is all-powerful, but God doesn't love us. So God won't stop it. And so you've got this circular debate is maybe God loves us, wants to, but can't because he's not all-powerful, but an all-powerful God could, but chooses not to, maybe because he doesn't love us. We debate these things and we form our opinions and our perceptions of who is God and what's God capable of doing and why doesn't God do these things. Well, what is your perception of God? That's my opening question. And if you have a perception of who God is, what is it based on? Reality, experience, thoughts, whatever. Well, oftentimes what you see is what you get. And what you see in God is oftentimes what you experience. And then sometimes what we see in the world shapes our perception of who God is or what God is capable of doing, but it also distorts our perception of God. We see something like a tsunami, earthquake on the ocean floor, this great big tidal wave comes in and kills a bunch of people. Why couldn't God stop that? We see tornadoes, we see hurricanes, we see all these natural disasters, and why doesn't God stop it? We see them, we don't always experience them, but these things shape our experiences. They shape our knowledge and our thoughts of who God is. And then there's this thing called confirmation bias, that when we look out in the world, what we see what we want to see. Like when there's some tragedy, sometimes we'll see the pain and the unjust, the inequity inflicted upon innocent victims. We may also see organizations that step up and jump in and help. And it kind of depends on who are you watching and what are you watching that shapes our perception of God. It's called confirmation bias. And oftentimes what we see is what we get. And let's not forget, there's a lot of people out there that look at us Christians in our fallenness, in our imperfections, in our flawed, in our all the things that are wrong with us. The outside world looks at us and says, if that's what I see in you is what I think I'm going to get from God. And if we have cheated somebody, if we have done something unjust, maybe we got away with it, that's how people begin to perceive who God is. Well, let's switch gears for just a minute. Let's talk about cat food. No, not for you. Cat food. I bought this at Walmart. I bought it for my little sermon tonight. I'm going to donate it tomorrow to the animal shelter here in Holden. It's just a bag of cat food. But if you look at the front cover here, nowhere does it say cat food. It says Friskies. It says seafood. And again, I kind of wrestle with how do we know that cats have any inclination toward ocean-going fish? Cats are land animals. If I was going to devise a cat food, I'd probably flavor it mouse or squirrel or backyard songbird or maybe baby rabbit. My grandmother kept a lot of cats in the barn. Feral, wild, they'd hiss at you, and any opportunity you reached out, they'd scratch you. Grandma kept them around because they were real good about keeping the rabbits out of the garden and the mice and the rats out of the barn. And quite frankly, she didn't have any affection for them. She just was more utilitarian in her appreciation of what they could do and what they did. And sometimes she had this upside-down cover for some barrel, and she'd pour a big old bag of cat food in there, and they'd all come running and eat up, but for the most part, she wanted them catching mice and that kind of stuff. When the 25 years we lived in Jackson, we had 3 cats. I didn't have them all at the same time. The first cat came with rather devious motives. My oldest daughter was in first grade. Her teacher, Mrs. Floyd. I have not forgotten you, Barbie Floyd. Mrs. Floyd sent a note home with the children, and she told the children in class, boys and girls, take this note home. This note says, I have free kittens. If you, that is the parent, would like to have a free kitten, here's my information, you can give me a call. Well, my daughter wanted a cat. Thank you, Mrs. Floyd. I have not forgotten. So we went out to Mrs. Floyd's farm, and they had a bunch of kittens, black and white, and kittens are really cute. The kitten that we kind of liked, all black, and had this white upper lip. It looked kind of like Groucho Marx. So we called that kitten Stash. First thing my wife did is declawed all 4 feet. I don't think we realize just how severe that surgery is or how it renders a cat now defenseless because it has no claws. But we wanted an indoor cat. My wife, who has experience with the cat, said, we're going to declaw the cat all 4 feet and it won't scratch up the furniture. Stash was really an outdoor cat. Every opportunity when a door was open, a little crack, Stash would slip out, lay in the grass, watch the wind blow the trees, smell the air. Stash really wanted to be an outdoor cat. We tried to keep it in. Stash would find its way out. And eventually, Stash just kind of disappeared. We don't know if Stash ran off. We walked up and down the highways looking for, the dead body of Stash. We don't know if a coyote got it. That was Stash. That was our first cat. The third cat was named Eddie. Eddie was a neutered male. Let me tell you something. There is an inverse correlation between the property damage you inflict as a cat and the amount of money homeowners are willing to pay for your medical care. It's inverse correlation. Eddie went to the litter box one day, and as Eddie urinated, it hurt. So Eddie says, I'm not going to pee here. This hurts. So Eddie peed in front of the refrigerator. That hurt too. So Eddie decided to jump up on the couch. Gosh, it hurt when he peed there. So he peed over in the corner. That hurt. Peed on the rug in front of the front door. That hurt. Well, we took Eddie to the vet, and the vet gave us some really discouraging news that to fix Eddie was going to cost a lot of money. And again, the amount of veterinary care you receive as a cat is inversely proportional to the amount of damage you've done in the house. We very quietly decided to have Eddie put to sleep. It just was part of the surgical process when he was neutered, and it just didn't work out. The second cat, I can't remember what that cat's name was, but I called that cat Houdini. Now, Harry Houdini was an escape artist. This cat, cat number 2, would disappear into thin air. Sometimes we didn't see that cat for days. We'd call that cat's name, whatever it was. Like I said, I called it Houdini. Wouldn't show up. So every so often, we would take the bag of cat food, and when we'd rattle it like that, sometimes that cat would come out. And of course, kids would love on that cat and want to pet it, and he just wanted to eat and disappear. Sometimes just doing that wasn't enough. So he'd fill his bowl, and by morning, the cat food was gone. Somewhere in the middle of the night, that cat snuck up, got that food, went back into hiding. And sometimes, I tell you, it's kind of interesting, the sound. I mean, quite frankly, I don't know what cats see in this cat food stuff. I say, there's something kind of musical about this that I get a kick out of. Of course, my dogs are kind of the same way, but when you take cat food, or any food for that matter, and you hear that kind of pinging of the food on the bowl, it's like a dinner bell. And sometimes that cat would show up, and most times not, and quite frankly, little brown amorphous little nuggets of what? It's seafood? I don't think I'd call that seafood. It tastes more like chicken. Not barbecue chicken either. Huh. This will make a pretty good snack. You know how like goldfish, eat one, you need to eat 20. I've almost eaten enough of this stuff. I wouldn't want to eat 20 of these. I wonder if all that cat food is really the same. This bag is described as seafood. Really? I mean, just change the label, and for all we know, it could be mouse. No, it tastes kind of like dark meat chicken, like thighs, maybe wings. What if I put some milk on it? You know, traditionally cats like milk. That's the legend. Milk is not nutritionally good for cats. Some people say it's not good for humans. Well, I don't know. It doesn't really taste like seafood. And of course, what am I expecting? Am I expecting like Red Lobster and those cheesy biscuits or something? So, I don't know. Kind of a disappointment, really. This isn't going to replace my normal meal. Let's get back to my main point here. Cat food. What you see, it's what you get. It's cat food. And quite frankly, for all of us human beings, it's just cat food. Quite frankly, seafood, that's probably the biggest lie on this package. And again, you notice anywhere on this package, it didn't say cat food. We presume it's cat food. And what you see is what you get. Well, back to my opening question. What is your perception of God? And is what you see what you get? And a lot of times what we see comes from tragedies or reading the news of unjust suffering. In the 14th chapter of John, the opening lines in this chapter are very familiar to us because a lot of times we read these at funerals. And Jesus says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." John 14, verse 1. "You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm coming and going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way?" Jesus answered, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him." Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father, that is God, living in me, who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves." If what you see is what you get, what do you see in Jesus? If Jesus is the reflection of God, how does the life and the ministry of Jesus then challenge and sometimes refute our perception of God? Take Mark's 5th chapter. A guy named Jairus, a ruler of the Jewish leadership council, his daughter is ailing. He comes to Jesus and says, "I need your help. Come and help me. My daughter is dying, and I need you to heal her." Jesus immediately goes with him. Great level of compassion, great level of urgency. And there's a whole lot more to that story, but it's the idea that Jesus was willing to go with him because of his heartfelt, that burden he has for his daughter. Take a look at chapter 6. There, the disciples are really busy. They've been teaching, they've been healing, and the Bible says they had no leisure, they had no free time, not even to eat. So Jesus says, "I tell you what, let's get in this boat. Let's go to the other side of the lake to a lonely, deserted place where we can get some rest, we can get some R&R, we'll get away from these crowds, we'll get away from these distractions, we can just kind of get back together." As they take this very slow boat ride across the lake, the crowd follows, though, on the shore. They walk there. They get there before Jesus gets there. And when Jesus and his disciples, they land the boat, the text says Jesus had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. In a few more paragraphs, one of the disciples says, look, it's getting late. Send them away. And Jesus says, well, we can't send them away. Let's give them something to eat. Well, what do we got to eat here? And they search around in John's gospel and his rendition of this story. There's a young boy, just a few loaves and a few fish. And Jesus says, here you go, feed them. And they go, how can we do this? What are these few food items in the face of what numbered 5,000 men, not to mention women and children? And Jesus does that by multiplying loaves and fishes. Because he has compassion, he cares about us, and he doesn't just simply send people away. I like, too, in Matthew's Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus offers us some wisdom. And he says, here's how you find the abundant life. When you go to pray, don't stand out in the street corner and pray these lengthy, noble prayers, these eloquent prayers that everybody's going to sit there and go, ooh, wow, that guy can pray. No, instead, Jesus says, go to your closet and just pray to God. Now, if you want the human accolades, if you want that fickle, fleeting moment of attention, yeah, go ahead and pray on the corner. But if you don't, if you want God to hear you, go in your little prayer closet. Likewise, when you give, don't announce it to everybody what you're giving. Don't draw attention to yourself. Instead, give, and just give quietly. And likewise, when you fast and you do your practices of your acts of righteousness, just do them quietly. God notices, God knows, and there's wisdom in that. And Jesus cares enough about us that he would tell us that here's how you do things. Here's how you find these connections with God. Don't work for the glory of the world. We work for the glory of God. And I like at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says, it's not enough just to hear this. Let me give you some advice. Do the work. So when I say, love your neighbor as yourselves, love your neighbor. Do that work. He tells a little parable. Here are people who hear the word, but they don't do anything about it. And Jesus says they won't find the abundant life. But here are people who hear the word, and they put those things into practice. And Jesus says, now here's a little warning. If you think it doesn't make any difference, if you just hear them and don't do anything, and the difference between hearing them and doing something, it's like two guys that built two identical houses. Everything was fine until the storm hit. One built his house on a rock. One built his house on sand. And when the storm hit, you could tell who was who. And so when Jesus says, don't just be a hearer, it's like building your house on a sand. But when we are hearers and doers, he says it's like building your house on a rock. And again, you look at the life of Jesus and all the good little things he tells us that we totally ignore or we don't think is any different whatsoever. So a little challenge out of this whole sermon is read the Gospels and look at what Jesus does. Look at what he does and then ask why. He healed 10 lepers. One came back, and Jesus commends the one who came back to say, thank you. Now, why does that make a difference in the leper's life? Why would that make a difference in our lives if we followed that advice to give thanks for the wonderful things that God has done for us? Think, too, about when Jesus came in on Palm Sunday. He wept over the city because of their poor choices. And then he went to the temple and kicked over the tables of the money changers because they were cheating people. He had a sense of justice about what he was doing. So look at what Jesus is doing. Ask, why is Jesus doing it? Why is this important to Jesus? And then ask, how does this life of Jesus reflect the nature of God? How does it challenge our perception of God? If we think God is just this curmudgeonly, old, irritable, like an old man on the front porch yelling at the kids to get off his grass, I would think we'd be challenged and changed by that to see that benevolent nature of God and how much God loves us. In fact, when Jesus was with his disciples on the Last Supper, just before that, he says, I'm going to give you a new commandment here, a mandate. That's why we call it Maundy, mandated Thursday. Love one another. And he washed their feet in demonstration of what he was willing to do for his disciples and his followers. And he says, you should do this too. Now, it doesn't mean literally we wash our neighbor's feet, but think of how we treat our neighbors and what we could be doing to help them. Here we are in this time of social distancing and shelter at home. Can we at least keep track of our neighbors? Can we stay this socially distanced safety? But can we at least relate to them a little bit? And how does all this impact our spirituality? And of course, part of our spirituality is also impacted on how we view God. And when you read these Gospels, every miracle that Jesus performed, every encounter he had with a person, every parable he taught, all reflected his advice for us. There's lessons in all that, but his care for us, his concern for us, also reflects the care and the concern that God has for us. When somebody were to ask me about my perception of God or what I think God is like, I'd say God is incredibly patient. God is infinitely merciful with all my stupidity. And God is very gracious. God is generous. That's how I perceive God, because those are the events in my life that have helped me understand who God is. And a lot of those things I see in Jesus. And then, of course, what about patience? Peter, if Peter was part of my crew, it's like Peter can't sit still. It's like Peter can't keep his mouth shut. Peter has no filter on what he says. I think I'd set Peter down someday in the market and say, Peter, go find another job. I think maybe selling fish. That suits you. We're going to go on, but I'm just going to leave you with a little advice. Find something else. Find another line of work. I think that's what I do. But Jesus is very, very patient. What about Judas? Here's Judas working his own agenda all the time. Jesus kept him close. And what about all this other dim-witted disciples? One of my favorite stories happens just after the feeding of the 5,000. They're getting in the boat. They're leaving the crowds again. And the disciples in this boat are beginning to argue about themselves of where are they going to get their next meal. Come on, man. You just saw Jesus multiply a couple loaves of fish, a couple loaves and a couple of fish. And you're concerned about where your next meal is coming from? If I was Jesus and we had gotten over to that other side of the lake, I would have said, fellas, I tell you, park the boat, get out. I'm going to take the boat back to the other side where there are people who believe in me. But Jesus doesn't. Jesus hangs with them. Jesus accepts their imperfections, their stupidity, their impulsiveness. And that's how I see God. And the love that God has for us, God's infinite patience, his unfailing mercy. These are the reasons I think I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, because I see all the good things that God has for us. And of course, Jesus also gave this wisdom. He said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. Don't be surprised, you got trouble. But here's the good news. Jesus says, I have overcome the world. And so as we hang out in these shelter-at-home mandates, we wonder when this thing's going to end. We wonder what it's going to look like when it ends. We kind of wonder, what are we going to do when it ends? What are we going to do as a church? how are we going to get back together? How are we going to kind of crank up all these routines that we have fallen out of? In all these things, we just have to have that measure of faith. It's kind of like this cat food. It's what we see is what we get. And sometimes we just have to open our eyes to see the great things that God has for us. And it ain't cat food. God bless. And remember, we are followers of Jesus Christ. We walk by faith and not by sight. We will get through this with God's help. And once again, we will be together and we will celebrate this thing, the lessons that we learn, the lessons that we glean from this thing, and we will again follow God.